the program, which means you have Brett first, Katie second, Father Terry will be third, and then we'll have joint Q&A time for everyone at the end. I'll just do a very brief introduction immediately before you present. So I'll present Brett first, then you go, introduce Katie, then Katie goes, then introduce Terry, then Terry will go.
Yeah, and so if I go long, just stop me or let me know this.
That's my job. Yeah. I'll start
okay.
banging a drum and
yeah, because it's hard to
ahead of time
figure out how long it's going to be.
20?
Well, usually there's a minute or two grace period. So if you're at 22, that'll be all right. If you're hitting 25, then I'll probably start standing up and walking over menacingly.
He's got the cane,
yeah.
The vaudeville cane to pull us off.
It's a friendly group, but we just want to make sure we leave enough time for questions afterwards. That's the biggest thing. That's usually where the most
fun,
the most productive time is often the Q&A.
Absolutely.
So, okay, then get started there. All right, it's time for us to get started this morning. I'm going to ask everyone to kindly please take their seats. We'll start our first session. So first of all, good morning. Welcome to day number 2 of our CCHA annual conference. Good to see everyone made it to the morning session. That's outstanding. Before we begin with our presentation, I have 2 small announcements to make. Announcement number 1 is the bathrooms are a bit tricky to locate. So in case you need to use the bathroom, they're actually out the door, and they're actually inside the stairwell. So you gotta kind of think left-hand turn, another left. There's some signage, but it's not the easiest to find. You just go out and make a left, and you'll see the signs, but it's in the stairwell area. That's number 1. Commercial announcement number 2 I forgot to make last night. Because we are all scholars of religion here, as you may or may not know, in November of 2018, Toronto as a city is hosting the Parliament of World Religions. This is a major international event, first time ever being hosted in Canada. It's taking place November 1st through 7th, 2018 in Toronto. A lot of big-name international speakers will be there. If anyone plans on attending, members of the CCHA, which is all of you, we are provided with a 20% off discounted price. So if you're curious in going, want the coupon code to sign up for that discount, I have some flyers you can take away with you afterwards. So I'll leave these at the front. So if you want to grab one, you're most welcome to them. Also, if anyone needs extra copies of our program for today, I have extra copies up front here as well. Grab those at the break time. And also, we've arranged for some breakfast supplements. So if you want some extra sugar to get you going or some coffee, we have those available over there as well. But without further ado, the reason why we're here this morning is for our panel. This is session number 4. It's entitled New Directions in Catholic Education and Catholic Spirituality. I'm your moderator, Dr. Peter Baltudis. But we have 3 presenters for you today. I'll introduce each one directly before they speak. So the first we have today, our first presenter, is Brett Fawcett. Brett Fawcett teaches at Newman Theological College. He does some work up there. Just finished with his master's from there, is that correct?
Yeah,
okay.
That's for theological studies.
Excellent. And also, he just finished with his B.Ed from Concordia University at Edmonton as well. And he just shared with me that he's been offered a position teaching internationally in China.
That's right. And my wife, who's also a teacher. So.
And you accepted that?
We have accepted that,
okay.
yes.
So I'm glad to announce it then. That's great. So congratulations to Brett. We'll be heading internationally. This is Brett's first time presenting with us, so we're most happy to have you here. Brett is presenting to us this morning on, quote, Seeds of Civilization, end quote. The debate over publicly funded Catholic schools in Canada and the nature of multiculturalism. So, Brett.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everyone. As we've heard, my background is not in history. It's in theology and in education. So I know as a good historian, you're not supposed to be polemical, but I'm not a good historian. So I feel, it's not incumbent upon me to observe that, as you may find. In 1969, the Canadian philosopher George Grant published an essay dealing with the topic of public funding for Catholic schools in Ontario. In it, he refuted the idea that the state should have no involvement in promoting any religion. A constitutional government that operates by the consent of the governed rather than by force is necessarily invested in having most of its citizens hold certain beliefs, and its chief tool for promotion of these beliefs is education. North American schools generally promote the religion of democracy. Grant observed that in the past, the religion of the schools was Christianity because this was the majority religion of the population. But this was being replaced in both popular consciousness and in the schools by a mythicized secularity. Now, this is connected to Grant's famous thesis that Canada had collapsed culturally. Grant observed that Canada was founded as a compromise between British Protestants and French Catholics, who both wanted to preserve their respective civilizations dedicated to their religion against the influence of liberalism, which Grant defined as an imperialistic technological cultural force that erased communities, homogenized cultures, and reduced people to self-centered individuals. The early Canadians saw this liberalism in the looming country to the south, and formed Canada to try to withstand it, even to use public services in order to maintain their older cultures against it. But the Canadian project was ultimately a failure, and the Canadian people had largely accepted seductive American cultural assumptions. The history of publicly funded religious schools, especially Catholic and French Catholic separate schools in Canada, exemplifies this perfectly. What we find is a tendency in the opponents of separate schools to argue from a perspective of Americanist liberalism, often using the Jeffersonian notion of separation of church and state. And these arguments were often made, explicitly or otherwise, in the service of a project of forcing minority religious and racial groups into the white English liberal mold of the dominant classes. Edgerton Ryerson, in many respects the founder of the public school system in Ontario, which provided the template for the rest of Canada in some ways, showcases this perfectly. Among his other accomplishments, Ryerson was a Methodist minister, and his vision for a public school system was that it would inculcate Christian moral principles, but not any particular Christian creed. It is interesting how strong the insistence was by public school proponents that they would be Christian schools. But as innocuous as this may sound, it should be remembered that Ryerson thought that forging a national identity and unity meant using education to train people to forsake their cultural distinctiveness and adapt liberal English Canadian culture. As proof of this, remember that Ryerson was also the father of the residential schools, which had the project of killing the Indian and the child. The project of the residential schools cannot be divorced from Ryerson's vision of free universal education, because he saw education as a tool of homogenization in the service of a unifying culture. Ontario's Common School Act of 1841 allowed for religious and racial minorities to establish dissentient schools under certain circumstances. Ryerson disliked the separate schools, saying, quote, "I believe the fewer of these separate schools, the better," end quote. Though he tried to avoid open conflict, so he didn't try to shut them down. He thought they would kind of die off on their own. So he tried to weaken them until they sort of died out. Ryerson became the chief superintendent of education in 1846, and that year, his Common School Bill and the subsequent amendment the following year mitigated the ability of religious groups to set up their own separate schools, to the chagrin of his old rival, the Anglican bishop John Strawn. Now, I just want to note, the argument is sometimes made today, why do only Catholics have separate schools? What about other religions? But remember, it wasn't the Catholics who insisted on this. In Lower Canada, Protestants of any denomination were allowed to set up their own publicly funded schools, a point that Catholic defenders of separate schools in Protestant territories would often make. It was Ryerson who suppressed the establishment of non-Catholic separate schools, and would have only been too happy to get rid of the Catholic ones as well. Bishop Strawn was not very successful in resisting Ryerson, but the Catholic Bishop Charbonnel of Toronto was a dedicated defender of separate schools, and he and his clerics debated with Ryerson constantly on this subject. The debates often centered on what the content was of the instruction at mixed or public schools, with Charbonnel arguing that the education presented in these mixed schools was incompatible with Catholicism. For example, one frequent objection that Catholics made was that anti-Catholic textbooks were being used, anti-Catholic histories of England were being used in the mixed or public schools. Ryerson responded by pointing out that the School Act said that students did not need to read any textbooks that their parents objected to. And Charbonnel's rejoinder to this is it's a masterpiece of prose sarcasm. But the one line I really like is, would the government of Canada countenance schools in which pupils could read books supporting rebellionism, because no child would be forced to read them if their parents objected, and thereby all children would be protected in their loyalty to the country and His Majesty? Charbonnel recognized that the ethos of a school was as important as its explicit pedagogy. Ryerson would claim that separate schools were always a temporary measure introduced to protect the rights of minorities, and that, quote, until 1852, separate schools were never advocated as a theory, much less as a doctrine, and still less as an article of faith, end quote. Ryerson accused Charbonnel of turning this political issue into one about doctrine. Effectively, Ryerson was deciding for Catholics what they thought was essential belief. Moreover, in rejecting the idea that this was a religious liberty issue, Ryerson was adapting American liberal understandings of religious liberty rather than traditional Canadian understandings of religious liberty. At one point, Ryerson explicitly said, quote, our next step must be, if further legislation be called for, to take the sound American ground of not providing for or reorganizing separate schools at all, end quote. But it was not to be. In 1855, the Taché Act was passed, making separate schools easier to establish, and it was made even easier by the Scott Act of 1863. Now, I want to draw attention to the fact that the Scott Act was the work of an Irish Catholic MP, Richard Scott, during the episcopate of Archbishop Lynch of Toronto, who had been born in Ireland. I mention this because one often hears that the reason Confederation respected separate schools was as part of a compromise between French and English Canadians, and that since Quebec abolished separate schools in 1997, they're no longer holding up their end of the deal, so why should we hold up ours? But I think this neglects the important role that Irish Catholics played in this. D'Arcy McGee's efforts to get Irish Canadians on board with Confederation is widely recognized as being essential to Confederation's success, and McGee was a stalwart defender of separate schools. In a speech before the House of Assembly at Quebec, McGee insisted that this legislation for separate schools was not a priest's bill, it was a parent's bill. He'd actually submitted 63 petitions from laity for separate schools. So he maintained that this was what the common Catholic wanted. And those who voted against these bills, he said, were opponents of religious freedom. Quote, Catholics assert in the most solemn manner, this was what McGee argued, that they cannot, in conscience, divorce religious from secular instruction in schools which they support. Are you to be their judges for them as to what their consciences ought to determine in this matter? Are they to be guided by your conscience or their own? End quote. Perhaps McGee's most incisive point is, quote, no one has ever denied, to my knowledge, that education, in one of its aspects at least, is a religious question. It concerns the mind, the spirit, the immortal soul, end quote. Education being an inherently religious concern, McGee contended that respecting Catholic wishes to control their own schools was indeed a religious liberty question. He also noted that single or common school system was, quote, the creation of two despotisms. It was conceived in Prussia by Frederick the Great when he strove to weld together his scrap iron empire. It was followed in France during the Revolution by that other infidel Talleyrand, end quote. McGee contrasted this to the Protestant countries, Scotland, Switzerland, and Holland, whose successful education systems each had, quote, a strong infusion of dogmatic religion, end quote. And this was a real masterstroke by McGee, because oftentimes the argument would be, well, Catholic countries are much worse off than Protestant countries, so we should adopt their education model, the Protestant countries. And McGee points out, well, each of those countries does not just have a moral Christian school, they teach dogma in those schools. So if we really want to imitate them, we shouldn't have this kind of diluted public school system that only teaches morality and no creeds. In 1867, we finally have the British North America Act with its famous Section 93 protecting the existing provincial separate school legislation. Charles Tupper once said that without this compromise between Catholics and Protestants, and he actually, he doesn't say French and English, he says Catholics and Protestants, quote, there would have been no confederation, end quote. With this constitutional safeguard in place, the subsequent debates take on a legal aspect. Manitoba established separate schools in 1871, but in 1890, the provincial government of Thomas Greenway abolished separate schools and the official status of the French language. Johnny MacDonald actually encouraged Catholics in Manitoba to challenge the constitutionality of this, which they did in the case of Winnipeg v. Barrett, which went all the way to the Privy Council of Britain in 1892. The Privy Council held that the legislation was constitutional, and it seemed like separate schools in Manitoba had lost. But there was a glimmer of hope 2 years later when Brophy v. Manitoba also went before the Privy Council. And they held that while education may be under a provincial jurisdiction, an appeal can be made to the federal government if, quote, any right or privilege of the Protestant or Catholic minority of the Queen's subjects in relation to education, end quote, is breached, and that the federal government can enact remedial legislation to overturn any such laws. So this led to political controversy, both provincially and nationally. The federal conservative government of Mackenzie Bowell tabled a bill in 1896 promoting remedial legislation on behalf of the separate schools in Manitoba. The opposition Liberal Party of Wilfrid Laurier, himself a French Catholic, opposed the remedial legislation. And this is why it's somewhat mistaken to regard the historical controversy over Catholic schools as being between Catholics and Protestants, since there are examples, like Bowell, who was a high-ranking Orangeman, of Protestants actually taking the side of separate schools, perhaps because they realized the threat to Protestantism and the Protestant kind of integrity, the trajectory that would happen if we started suppressing Catholic separate schools. I think instead we have to see it as more of a clash between cultures and liberal dominance or imperialism, more so than between Catholic and Protestant. Now, this controversy sparked several debates in print over separate schools, from a constitutional but also from a moral perspective. One notable example of one of these debates was between Frederick Coate Wade and John S. Ewart. Now, Wade was the counsel for the Manitoba government, and he wrote publicly defending its campaign against separate schools. In one book, Wade actually cited a United States Supreme Court ruling which defined the individualistic American interpretation of religious liberty as something for Canadians to imitate. Like Ryerson, Wade maintained that the public schools could teach Christian morality, like the Ten Commandments, without getting into specific doctrines, and could therefore be acceptable to all Christians. But Ewart saw the weakness of this argument, and Ewart was not a Catholic. He was actually from a Presbyterian background, but he was the counsel for the Catholic Church in Manitoba before the Privy Council. And his witty and thorough defense of separate schools, I think, ought to earn him some sort of honorary canonization or something, because Ewart published a response to Wade, which, besides dealing with the legal question, also observed that the Ten Commandments cannot be taught in a doctrinally neutral way. Think of the commandment about not worshiping graven images. That can't be taught in a way that isn't going to either offend Presbyterians or Catholics. You can't teach Christian morality apart from Christian doctrine. And similar points were raised in a debate between the Reverend E.J.B. Salter and the oblate priest Adrian Maurice in the Winnipeg Free Press. Father Maurice's argument was that Catholics did not want special rights. They wanted the same rights that Protestants had, since Protestants, he argued, already had their own public schools. Now, this was an argument that was often made by Manitoba Catholics, that although the public schools may have nominally been non-denominational, they were actually Protestant schools for all intents and purposes. In 1893, Archbishop Taché of St. Boniface issued a pamphlet arguing specifically that public schools were a continuation of the Protestant schools that existed before 1890. He noted that not only were the superintendents, the members of the board, and the school inspectors all the same Protestants who had run the Protestant schools, but that the program of studies for teaching morals in the public schools was almost verbatim the same as the one that had been used in the previous Protestant schools. And again, importantly, the argument wasn't that this was bad, but simply the Catholics wanted the same rights that Protestants had. And what this highlighted was the inherent ambivalence in this public school system. Now, figures like Salter, following Ryerson, insisted that they wanted the public school system that would be generically but inherently Christian. And Catholic critics pointed out that this was impossible. You had to be at least somewhat doctrinally specific. And that was, in fact, something that Joseph Martin recognized. Joseph Martin was the Attorney General in the Greenway government who was responsible for abolishing separate schools, and he recognized this. Martin had said that acknowledging Protestantism in public schools was unfair, and his solution was, therefore, that we ought to make the schools completely secular. Other opponents of separate schools, like Dalton McCarthy, cared less about religion and more about, quote, taking up our French Canadians and making them British, end quote, which was also the goal of the political movement which called itself the Equal Rights Association. Notice the use of the term equal rights to cloak bigotry. We can detect a whiff of the residential school policy of killing the Indian and the child in language like this. And there are strong undercurrents of bigotry in a lot of arguments that were used against separate schools at the time. For example, Salter had argued that Catholics in Manitoba were poorer, and I guess insinuated that there was something about Catholic culture that was inferior as a result of that. F.C. Wade, in probably the most grotesque example of this that I found, actually cited statistics suggesting that Catholics were more likely to be criminals in Manitoba, and cited this as proof that we shouldn't have separate schools for Catholics. We ought to kind of bring them into the public schools and shepherd them into, I don't know, a lower crime rate or something. But Wade also argued that the quality of Catholic schools was a lot worse, and he cited a lot of examples of what he regarded as examples of poor questions from Catholic school examinations to prove that Catholic schools were inferior. Ewart's rebuttal to this argument pointed to problems in the public schools as well. And I think this is where some of the funniest stuff in Ewart can be found, is when he's talking about the content of the instruction. For example, Wade had made light of the fact that in Catholic schools, students were asked to learn about biblical history instead of, real topics for schools. Ewart countered by pointing out that in the public schools, students were asked to write entire essays about trivial aspects of the works of Charles Dickens and Walter Scott. Ewart writes at one point, Mr. Wade would select as his subject for study not Abraham, but Scrooge and his cold office. Well, to some extent, it is a matter of taste. End quote. Ewart also teases Wade for taking issue with some of the examination topics. So Wade had criticized the fact that students in separate schools were asked, describe the establishment of Christianity in England. And Ewart countered Wade by saying, well, perhaps he would prefer if they were asked, describe the accomplishments of Protestantism in Manitoba. Maurice, meanwhile, argued that Catholic schools were good quality. At one point, Salter, who's arguing against separate schools, he makes a grammatical mistake, and Maurice counters by saying, there are probably francophone girls in the separate school system who wouldn't have made that mistake. They probably speak English better than you do. However, whatever the merits of the Catholic schools may have been, the majority were against them. Of course, the legislation was to protect the minority anyways. Greenway declared a provincial election in 1896, which he won with a landslide. And federally, Laurier's Liberals took over the government and killed the remedial legislation. Instead, Laurier forged what was known as the Laurier-Greenway Compromise, allowing, among other meager accommodations for French instruction, for a half hour of religious instruction in public schools at the end of each school day if there was enough demand for it. In 1897, Pope Leo XIII issued an encyclical in response to the Manitoba school question. The Holy Father praised the missionaries who had brought to Canada, quote, the light of Christian wisdom and a more elevated culture and the first seeds of civilization, end quote, seeds which had grown into one of the most civilized and glorious nations in the world. He was clear that the compromise was defective, imperfect, and insufficient, but that Catholics should work with it for the time being while striving for a more just arrangement. There were other examples of opposition to separate schools which were more or less successful depending on where you look. The 1870 Common Schools Act in New Brunswick suppressed separate schools and displays of religion in the classroom, and attempts to have it declared unconstitutional were unsuccessful, which led to pretty violent riots. Meanwhile, the 1875 Northwest Territories Act established separate schools in what we would today call the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan. But the 1892 school ordinance put the control of curriculum, school inspection, and teacher certification under the control of the superintendent of education, who was not really a friend of separate schools, David Goggin. And he couldn't get rid of separate schools, so he found other ways to kind of weaken or mitigate them. For example, there was an order of nuns called the Faithful Companions of Jesus who ran a lot of the schools, and their rule forbade them from either living outside of their order or going to school outside of their order. So David Goggin, superintendent of education, who I think is operating out of Manitoba at this point, declares that to be certificated, you have to travel to where he is and take classes under him. So, there's nothing against the nuns, but he's just made it impossible for them to be certificated as teachers. And there's one example of a nun from England who had been teaching for 30 years who made quite a fuss about this and was successful, but that was the kind of tenor of it, was finding ways to kind of weaken or mitigate separate schools if you couldn't get rid of them altogether. Father Leduc actually wrote a pamphlet about this called Hostility Unmasked, where he documented a lot of cases of this. And he actually accused the government of the sin of hypocrisy, officially claiming to support separate schools, but functionally trying to assimilate them and their student bodies, who were mainly immigrants, to the agenda of the public schools and the government. Other backdoor ways of breaking the influence of separate schools have been discovered in the century since then, most notably the recent court decision in the Theodore case, which declares, of course, this whole thing about non-Catholic students not being able to get funding and so forth. Now, at a time when we are coming to really understand the grotesque way that Canada has used education, to assimilate and abuse minority communities, most notably First Nations culture in the residential schools. We should look, I'm trying to recontextualize our history here. We ought to look at the history of this debate over separate schools, which is still raging, as a question of genuine multiculturalism, in which different visions of reality and of the good are allowed to truly coexist and aren't sort of, all sublimated to the official agenda or the official government program. And we ought to carefully consider whether the arguments against separate schools ever have a whiff of that old project of colonialization. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. Our second presenter today is Katie M. Gemmel. Is I say it properly?